Rain pounded against the asphalt as David skidded to a stop, his breath misting in the cold air. He knelt by the injured dog sprawled in the middle of the road, its fur matted and muddy, its sides heaving with labored breaths. A pair of glaring headlights bore down on them, but David waved frantically, shouting until the car veered away, splashing a wave of water over him and the dog. Heart pounding, he scooped the trembling animal into his arms and bolted toward the sidewalk. "You're gonna be okay," he murmured, though the words were as much for himself as for the dog. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, amber and piercing, before closing again. David didn't have time to think about why the dog seemed familiar. He hailed a cab, dripping wet and clutching the animal like a lifeline, ignoring the driver's protests about the mess. Earlier that evening, David had been trudging home from yet another grueling shift at the diner. His dreams of becoming an artist felt like a distant memory, buried beneath overdue rent and mounting credit card bills. The city's glittering skyline mocked him as he passed luxury apartments and high-end boutiques, a stark contrast to his cramped studio and second-hand clothes. Still, he first spotted the dog near a dumpster in an alley, scavenging for scraps. It was limping, its coat a patchwork of grime and neglect. Something about its defiant posture, even in its weakened state, struck a chord with him, but before he could approach, the dog darted into traffic, setting off the chain of events that led to this moment. At the veterinary clinic, David paced the waiting room, soaked to the bone and clutching his phone, unsure how he would pay for the emergency care. When the vet finally emerged, her expression was cautious but hopeful. "He's stable for now. Lucky you brought him in when you did." Relief washed over David, followed swiftly by anxiety. "How much is it going to cost?" he asked, bracing himself. Before the vet could respond, a sharp voice interrupted. "I'll cover it." David turned to see a woman in an impeccably tailored suit standing in the doorway. Her face was familiar, her name just on the tip of his tongue. Behind her stood two burly men in matching uniforms, their expressions stern. "The dog belongs to my family," she said, stepping forward. "His name is Max, and he's been missing for weeks." David's mind reeled. Of course, he'd seen her on the news. Evelyn Carlyle, heir to the Carlyle fortune and one of the most influential people in the city. The dog had seemed familiar because its picture had been plastered all over social media with a hefty reward for its safe return. Back in her private car, Evelyn glanced at David, who sat awkwardly in his damp clothes, Max curled up at his feet. "You didn't have to go to such lengths to save him," she said, her tone softer now. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." David shrugged. "He needed help. That's all that mattered." She studied him for a moment, then reached into her bag and handed him an envelope. "The reward, as promised." David hesitated. "I didn't do it for the money." "I know," Evelyn said with a faint smile. "Which is why you deserve it." Inside the envelope was more money than David had ever seen in his life, enough to cover his debts and give him a fresh start. But it wasn't just the money that changed his life that night. Evelyn, impressed by his selflessness, later commissioned him to paint a portrait of Max, a project that led to other opportunities and ultimately reignited his passion for art. As for Max, he became a regular fixture in David's life, often visiting the studio with Evelyn and her family. The scrappy stray that had brought them together became a symbol of second chances. Not just for David, but for everyone whose lives he touched.